Hello everyone and welcome back to the final segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, and we return to tonight's game between the Saints and the Chiefs for Monday Night Football, specifically on the fantasy side of things. I gave you a general betting preview to start off today's show. We end on the fantasy side of things. We're talking specifically about who to start and who to sit. Potentially is the final game for you to get that one over on your opponent this week in fantasy. The last minute addition that you need to get you over the hump. Without further ado, let's jump into it. And there are a lot of ways you can go in this game because I don't necessarily know, like I said, when I mentioned the betting odds, who's going to step up for the Chiefs and what kind of game plan the Saints are going to come out with. So this could be ultimately altered in many different ways. I could be completely wrong about who I have starting and who I have sitting. And you might also disagree with me and let me know what you think in the comments as well. Without further ado, here are my personal start-sit options for tonight's game. And the obvious start, to start with the Saints, on the Saints side of things, is Alvin Kamara. Because let's think about this. I feel like I said, and what Andre kind of alluded to with Derek Carr, is that you don't necessarily trust Derek Carr to quote-unquote win you games. You trust Derek Carr to make plays that don't hurt you in order to win games. You trust him to play mistake-free football, most importantly. And so, in order to play mistake-free football, and because he's not a mobile guy, you have to run the football in this game. And the Chiefs' front, yes, is one of the more mysterious run defenses one might face in a campaign. It's still one that can affect how you play. And Steve Spagnuolo will always be someone who can scheme up for any kind of attack. And so Alvin Kamara is going to have to be the X factor. He's going to have to get the bulk of touches in this game. So not for nothing, this feels more forced than anything. Me saying that Alvin Kamara should start for you in tonight's game. But when I look at the Saints' offense, the best way for them to attack the Chiefs, because the Chiefs are still a big play threat. Let's not forget about Xavier Worthy. Let's not forget about what Travis Kelce could do in this game. I feel like as long as you keep them off the field, keep the time of possession on your side, then you can win this game, potentially. Then you can keep this closer than people expect, at the very least. And so Alvin Kamara is the best option to do that, and he will always receive enough touches where, even if he doesn't have a big game, you feel comfortable with his workload as a fantasy football manager. So he's my first start off the board on this list. But then, let's look at the sitting side of things. And I'm sorry, Andre, about this if you're still watching, but I feel like Chris Olave might be a sit. And it's not necessarily because of the game plan, like I said. It's because, if Derek Carr wants to be ambitious in this game and win with a big play, Shaheed is going to have to be the guy who makes that big play. Because for the most part, it's going to be limiting the Chiefs' time on the field. And Derek Carr is going to want to get the ball out quickly. And yes, Olave can help in that regard. He's perhaps the best route runner on the Saints. I don't necessarily think it's going to be important yardage in terms of swinging the odds in your favor in your fantasy game. It's going to be tactical yardage that's not pretty. I still think, if you're still watching, Andre, that bet can hit for Olave at 60.5 yards. But it's going to be a very tedious game for him. So, make of it what you will. Take it with a grain of salt. But I just think that's the way it's going to be for Chris Olave in this game. It's not going to be pretty. I still think he's going to have a lot of targets and receptions. But it's not going to go for many yardage. And it's not going to really help you at all in terms of swinging the odds in your favor in a fantasy landscape. As Sheppy Sweetspot says, it's tough to say a stud like Olave. But I just think that Olave right now is someone who I can't, fully buy into in a Saints offense that week in, week out could have a different game plan, depending on who they face. So, Chris Olave, unfortunately, is going to have to sit. And also going to have to sit Derek Carr. Like I said, I still think he's going to have the occasional big play in this game. But like I said, he's not going to have many yardage opportunities. He's not going to want to, risk it unless he knows he's confident in that deep play being open for him. So, sitting Derek Carr seems like the valuable option, as Shapiro Sweeper says better have two good wide receivers in the room. Well, I feel like you could have one good receiver in the room or superstar receiver in the room and just have a balanced guy. That's what I'd have left this week. For example, I had Garrett Wilson, who finally had a big game for me in my fantasy squad, and then I supplemented him with Tutu Atwell, and I'm beating my guy by like 120 points. Not necessarily have to have two quote-unquote good wide receivers. You could have a variety of different ways to go about your wide receiver room. It's just that you have to, in certain matchups, make business decisions. And so, business decisions have to be made in tonight's game, and you also might not consider this night's game to be the best way to garner points. You may have already gotten all the points you might want from your Sunday players. So, it's just dependent on whether or not you feel like Olave is going to have a good game for you in this round. I feel personally, based off the matchup itself, that he won't. But it's a good point about having wide receivers in your room that you trust. But the Chiefs side of things, let's get to the Chiefs. I think the start here is obvious for at least the wide receivers. It's Xavier Worthy. Because, let's think about it. Even if, he's not the number one target getter for the Chiefs tonight, he's the most, ready to make the big play for the Chiefs. He's the most prepared to make that one explosive play or two explosive plays with the ball in his hands for the Chiefs. And that could be good enough for you. If you're someone who just needs that couple points for your fantasy squad to swing you over the fence, that's Xavier Worthy. That's Xavier Worthy because of the fact, yes, he's not going to have, the most big plays or the most targets, but that one big play changes things in fantasy. You know what I mean? He could just have that one big play and do nothing else, and you would still be able to win with that one big play. So we're gonna have to be wary about it because, he's not, the target getter. If you're in a PPR league and in a standard league, it might be too risky relying on him to make that big play. But at the end of the day, he profiles right now, at the very least, at the Chiefs wide receiver one. So why not expect him to have wide receiver one potential in his yardage production? And then you go over to the sit side of things, and it's Travis Kelce, unfortunately, who I have to bring up in this kind of situation. Because let's be real. As Andre says, I really like Kareem Hunt tonight. Saints linebackers hurt. That's a good point. I mean, the Chiefs aren't necessarily a team who I think about as wanting to run the football. But in a situation like this, if you want to beat the Saints at their own game, you definitely could. And not for nothing, Patrick Mahomes, as much as he wants to win games with his arm and wants to involve a lot of people in this offense, he himself is saying, well, I got to be better in that regard. I got to clean up on my mess a little bit. And so, how the Chiefs want to approach their running game could be highly dependent on whether or not, Patrick Mahomes gets the deep plays. Because the Saints' defense, yes, they're hurt, but they're also opportunistic, no matter what or who's out there. And you make a good point about their linebackers being hurt because you might want to attack them not just in the run game, but also in the short passing game, the short yardage game. You can do things with Kareem Hunt that you can't necessarily do with, say, Carson Steele or Sam and J.P. Ryan. In the passing game as well as the running game. So that's an interesting point. He's someone who I'm still wary of in terms of his play style and also his propensity to get injured, but I still think he can be serviceable at the very least for the Chiefs, and potentially for a fantasy football squad. You're not going to be the prettiest in your fantasy football team. Maybe you're more of a flex guy, but that's a good point, Andre. I really appreciate that comment because I wasn't necessarily thinking about him in those terms. But sitting Travis Kelce just seems like the right option for the Chiefs. I think that, age is still a factor, and the fact that, it took a little bit of time for him to get situated in this offense. I don't necessarily think this is the time to, grow into this offense, right? Because he's going to have to grow up quick. And I don't necessarily think Travis Kelce is prepared, as he was in past seasons. He still is someone who I think Mahomes will still value as the season goes on, but not as much as before. And then the final player who I want to mention in this whole start situation is someone who you might not even have in your fantasy squad. Might want to pick him up on waiver wires if tonight's game goes well for him. And that is Justin Watson. I really like this guy. I really, really like this guy for the Chiefs. A solid route runner. Maybe not playing as many snaps, maybe not running as many routes as other guys in this team, but should get more love for what he does. Always gets open. Kind of the out-of-structure guy from Mahomes, as Andre said. I took Kamara over receiving yards at 34.5. I think that will hit, mainly because I don't know how the Chiefs are going to set up. Do they respect the deep ball? Respect Shaheed's deep threat? Or do the Saints feel like they have an opportunity to chip away at the Chiefs' front here and keep them respectable? That's an interesting point. I feel like Kamara in the receiving game is a big threat still, but I do want to see whether or not, Carr has a couple deep shots. I want to see it earlier in the game than people think. I want to see it like mid-first quarter, early first quarter. So I think that this bet could still hit, but it's going to be contingent on, him being a trustworthy part of this team. As Andre also says, I'm looking to move on from Ramondre after the big game. For him, there's a package of Ramondre and Zay Flowers get me James Cook. I don't see why it doesn't, because, it's a 2-for-1 swap, and, James Cook is becoming one of those players where he goes as his team goes, and understand would you trade London for A.J. Brown? I don't think so. I like Dre London. He's growing into the season. But going back to that James Cook trade, I think that could be what trade that could happen because, James Cook is going to be a volatile player, right? But more often than not, he's someone who the Bills just trust too often not to, ignore him. So picking him up with a Ramondre Flowers kind of option, especially if the guy who you're trading with's team is deep, could be viable. But for the London A.J. Brown trade, I don't really like it that much because of the fact that London seems like he's getting more comfortable growing into the season. He's not going to get, he did get the lion's share of the targets in their win over the Bucs. And he did get hurt, though. But when all is said and done, I trust Raheem Morris's play calling more than Nick Sirianni's in terms of allowing Drake London to be that wide receiver one. So I wouldn't necessarily let the trade go through. But that will just about do it for this show. Let me know what you think.